All right, I will say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev. To thank Josh and Becca Freeman for dedicating all the Shirman and Drushos this month. Le'ilui Nishmas, Josh's father, Yisrael Yehuda Ben refuah. To thank Malka Esterson for dedicating the Shurim this month in memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib ben haKohen, Sarah Rachel bas Baruch Avraham, Hinda bas Henoch Efraim, and a zechus of the continued Gezunt and Haslacha for Mr. Morton Esterson ad Me'er Ve'esim Shonim Tovos. To thank the Pepper family for dedicating the Shurim this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Shmuel's brother, Yosef Dovid Ben Yaakov. To thank our week of learning sponsors, Ayal Sara Steinberg, and the zechus of refuah shelema for Shalamis bas Susha, and Hilary and Akiva Kent in memory of Hilary's father, Harold Mitnick, Tzvi Hirsch, Ben Chanoch. We thank all of our sponsors for their generosity. And we'll say with that, let us begin. So good, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Mem Beis 42. And we are picking up, I will say, actually on Mem Aleph on Beis 41b. We left off at the Gemara, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 lines up from the bottom. Tanya. So we spoke, again, same topic. Same topic. It's going to be the same topic for the next couple of days through the end of the parak. Okay. Good. Through the end of the parak, I will say, where we are discussing that Reuven makes a neder that Shimon cannot get any benefit from him. Again, what becomes prohibited and what becomes permitted under that neder. So Tanya, lo yirchatz imo ba'ambati. So Reuven should not bathe together with Shimon in a pool. Remember, again, as we spoke about yesterday in the Mishnah discussed the idea, interestingly enough, because when a person's in a pool, or a tub, a second person comes in, the water level rises. That act of the water level rising, or that result of the water level rising, is considered to be Hanoch. It's considered to be a form of benefit, and therefore Allah Shalamis should not do it in a case where one is under a neder. V'lo yashin imo b'mita, bein gedola bein katan meir, and Reuven should not sleep in the same bed as Shimon, because it provides right body heat, whether it's a big bed or a small bed. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Huda says, no. Gedola b'mosach Shamim, uktani b'mosach Hama. Rabbi Huda says, it is permitted for Reuven to sleep in the same bed as Shimon if it's a large bed during the winter, or a small bed during the summer. Large bed during the winter, because since there's space, Shimon's really not going to benefit from the body heat. And ultimately, again, a small bed during the summer, because during the summer anyway, one does not want body heat. So the Gemara says, Rochitz imo ba'ambati gidola. Similarly, again, Reuven can bathe with Shimon in a large pool, large tub, because that way, again, when Reuven enters, after Shimon's already in there, the water level really doesn't rise in a significant way. Umazia imo b'kitana. But say this is not included in the Mishnah, but here in the Brayso it says, and Reuven could go into the Shvitz. Right? He could go into the Shvitz with Shimon, even if it's a small Shvitz, even if it's a small sauna. What's the reason for that? Because we'll say at the end of the day, more than one person in the Shvitz doesn't have an impact on the Shvitz experience. And therefore, again, there's no hanoah that Shimon receives. Aval, meisiv imo alamita, but again, Reuven can sit with Shimon on the same bed. Va'ochel imo ala shochan. He could eat with him at the same table. Now, I will say, to eat with him at the same table is the chiddush over there is, you might have thought that maybe they would come to share food, which could potentially be problematic. Kamash malon, that's not the problem. But they cannot share in the same plate. Now, I will say, this is actually an interesting case. The sharing in the same plate, we made reference to this yesterday. We made reference to this yesterday, I will say, that the tamchui is this shared plate. What's the concern? The concern there is that halacha l'maisa, if let's say Reuven eats less, Shimon gets more. Right? So that's why there's a hanoah that's involved in there. So the Gemara is aval, therefore again they cannot eat from the same plate. Aval ochel hu minat tamchui hachozer. But ultimately again, what can they eat from? They can eat from what's called a tamchui hachozer. Tamchui hachozer means that, let's say, again, they're guests somewhere. So we'll say there were different types of platters. So often people would eat from a shared platter, but halacha l'maisa, again, if anything was left over, it would go back to the balabayis. When you have what's called a tamchui hachozer, what ends up happening, halacha l'maisa, is there's usually a ton of food in there. So because there's a lot of food, whatever Reuven does or doesn't eat, however much or however little, is not going to impact Shimon. Good. Both says that's the sugya. Mishnah. Similarly again, lo yochal, so we'll say same case. Remember again, we're constantly dealing with the same case. Reuven makes a neder saying, Shimon, you cannot get any benefit from me, or I cannot convey any benefit to you, Shimon. So now the Mishnah goes on. Lo yochal ima mina avos shlifnei apolim. So we'll say, imagine for a moment, again, same case of the neder, but imagine for a moment, Reuven and Shimon are both workers. They're both workers. Now it was customary, depending on the employment arrangement, to go ahead and feed your workers. So Reuven and Shimon cannot eat. And I will say it's interesting. The lashon of avos is a trough. Now I will say avos is usually used in the context by animals, not by people. If you take a look at the Ran for just a moment, the Ran I will say on the right hand side, fourth line up before it gets wide. Incorrect. The intermediate wide lines. First, lo yochal imamina avos shalpalim ka'arig b'gol shlosim ne'palim. We'll say so. This trough, this avos, is essentially a very large platter that the employer would put before his workers. Shemidoch shem amelim ochlin harbe. Because the workers are physical laborers, they eat a lot. Va'ofsin ofse kivehemos umishum hachi nikra avos. That's why it was called the trough. It was customary to go ahead and put food, right? You would feed your laborers, and because we're talking about manual labor, therefore they would eat a lot. So the Ran goes on and he says, so what's very interesting. Therefore, again, if let's say Reuven eats a little, that turns out to be a benefit for Shimon. Why? Why? Because now Shimon has more food. So that's the Mishnah. Go back to the Mishnah now. If Reuven and Shimon are workers together, and Reuven made this neder that Shimon is not permitted to benefit from him, so they cannot eat from the same platter. What's a very interesting case. Similarly, if they're both laborers and they're both working in a vineyard together, they cannot work on the same row of the vineyard together. What's the pshat? We'll take a look at the Ran again. In the wide lines, the widest lines, it's the second line in Bu'uman. Shura sakere. This refers first to a row in the vineyard. Umishum hachi lo ya'ase imo shekishu chofer lefanav asakarka nahaneu. The kamarafi le la'ara va'afilu rachok mimenu aser Rabbi Meir. The gaza rachok mishum karal. So we're going to see what this means is like this. So imagine for a moment Reuven and Shimon. Right? Reuven made an neder that Shimon can't get any benefit from him. Reuven and Shimon are both laborers in a vineyard. So what happens now? What does Rabbi Meir? What does the Mishnah say? Reuven and Shimon can't work in the same row of the vineyard together. Why? They're planting vines. So what do you have to do to plant vines? You have to dig up the earth. The concern is that if they're working in the same row, when Reuven digs, he's softening the earth for Shimon as well, right? It makes it easier for Shimon to dig if Reuven's already softening the earth. So therefore, again, they cannot go ahead and work on the same row because it turns out that Reuven is going ahead and giving benefit to Shimon. These are the words of Rabbi Meir. The Chum say, Osa, the the Chum say, no. They can work on the same row as long as what? They're distant from one another. In other words, the problem only comes about if they're working in close proximity to each other. But if halacha l'maaseh they're working at a distance from one another, it's not a problem. Good, says the Gemara, Bekarav lo pligi da'aser. So the Gemara says everyone agrees that Reuven and Shimon, if they're working in the same row in the vineyard, everyone agrees that they cannot work in close proximity to each other, because in that circumstance, Reuven, if he digs the soil, is going ahead and benefiting Shimon. There'll be less effort for Shimon to expend. So ki pligi, where does the machlokes come up? Berachok, if they're working far away from one another. In other words, same row, but at a distance. Rabbi Meir savar kazuna rachok mishum karov. Rabbi Meir says, no, we have to be concerned that if they work close, right, even if they work far away, they may come to work close to one another. The Gemara says, the kamerafi leila ara kamei. For Rabbanan sabri lo gazrinon. The Rabbanan say, no, we're not goes. In other words, as long as they're not working in close proximity to each other, ultimately, again, even if they're in the same row, it's fine. And we're not concerned that ultimately, again, working at a distance will come to lead them to work close to one another. And that's how the Rambam Haskins like the Rabbanon as well. Therefore, Allah Chalamaysa, Reuven and Shimon could work in the same row in the vineyard together as long as they're working at a distance from one another, so that it's clear that whatever work Reuven is doing is not giving benefit to Shimon. Incredible. Top of Membeis. Hamudra Hana Mechaver Lefnei Shvius. So we'll say, very interesting case. Right, so what happens? Reuven makes a neder that Shimon cannot get benefit from him. That's the same case. I will say, so imagine for a moment, 42a, top line. So imagine over here in this case, what occurs? So Reuven is making this neder before Shemitah. Before Shemitah, so the Gemara says, so what happens? Eino yoreh l'sof sadeu. So in this case, we'll say, Shimon is not permitted to enter into Reuven's field. Ve'eino ochal min hanotos. Nor can he eat from notos. I will say notos refers to produce which extends outside of Reuven's field. So let's say, for example, Reuven has an apple tree. Right, so again, it's a case over here. Reuven says to Shimon, Shimon, you are not permitted to get any hana'ah from me. This neder is taking place before the advent of the Shemitah year. So what does the Mishnah say? Shimon cannot enter into Reuven's field. Makes sense, because he's not allowed to get hana'ah from him. Right? If you look at the Ran, by the way, the Ran says, first Ran, Lo yorei tov sadeu, shamadir, demuder asra filu b'jvisa saregel. Because let's remember again, once Reuven says to Shimon, you are not permitted to get any benefit from me, benefit includes even what? Traversing the field, walking in the field. Therefore, Shimon cannot enter into Reuven's field. Not only that, let's imagine for a moment Reuven has an apple tree in that field, but a branch of the apple tree extends out of the field. Out of the field. So that now Shimon could pick an apple from Reuven's tree without what? Without what? Without having to go into the field. Nevertheless, that's aser. That's what's called notos. Notos. It extends out of the field. Nevertheless, again, remember, Shimon is prohibited to get benefit from Reuven. So even the axe, even though he could pick the apple without traversing the field, going onto the field, it's still going to be aser. Okay. Uba Shvius, interestingly enough, and on the Shemitah year, Eini yoreh l'tov sadeu, he cannot enter his field. Aval ochel hu min hanotos. So we'll say, hanatios hanotos. So we'll say, what if, halacha l'maisa, right? So what if Reuven made this same neder, but he made this neder on a Shemitah year? So Reuven says to Shimon, you cannot get any, I make a neder, you cannot get any benefit from me. He's making this on a Shemitah year. So we'll say, if it's a Shemitah year, so we're going to see Shimon still can't walk onto Reuven's field. We'll see why that is. However, Shimon could take notos. So again, if a branch from Reuven's tree extends out of the field, Shimon could go ahead and pick an apple off that tree and benefit from that apple. So we'll say, so just to clarify this case, two pieces over here. Same case we've had up until now. Reuven's taking a neder, Shimon, you cannot get any benefit from me. So again, case one, nothing to do with Shemitah. What's the halacha? Shimon can't walk into Reuven's field and can't even partake of fruit that extends out of the field, which makes sense, right? Because again, Shimon is enjoined from receiving hana'ah from Reuven. So he can't go on the field, can't take fruit even if it's extending off the field. What if Reuven made this neder during Shemitah? So in that case, Shimon still can't go on the field, but he can go ahead and get benefit from notos, from produce that extends outside of the field. Okay, next case. Again, we'll define that more in the Gemara. Nader hemenu machal. So we'll say, let's say now, case number 2 is a more specific neder. Remember again, case number 1 was hana'ah. Hana'ah's general covers everything. Let's say now, Reuven goes down and says, Shimon, I make a neder that you are not permitted to get any type of food benefit from me. No food benefit from me. So what's the halacha? So if you made the neder lefnei shvius, if the neder was made before the Shemitah year, yoreh b'soch sadehu ve'ino ochel min haperos. So we'll say that's the case. Then what happens? So we'll say because this neder is just about food, therefore what? Shimon is permitted to what? We'll say to enter into Reuven's field. So to walk into the field is not a problem. What can't he do? Eat the food of the field. Right? However, ubeshvius, if Reuven made this neder during Shemitah, yored va'ochel. In that case, I will say, then what? Shimon is permitted to come into the field. Right? Why is he permitted to come into the field? Because the neder never governed hana'ah. The neder just governed consumption, food, and it's Shemitah. So because it's Shemitah, therefore what? The produce doesn't belong to Reuven anyway, and therefore Allah says Shimon is permitted to partake of it. Good. So we'll say these are our two constructs in Mishnah. So one more time. Construct one is a neder hana. Reuven saying to Shimon, you may not get any benefit from me. Make a neder, you can't get any benefit from me. Okay? So that's construct one. Part A, neder was made before Shemitah. If made before Shemitah, Shimon can't enter into the field. Shimon also can't go ahead and eat notos, produce that extends outside of the field. Case 2, neder was made during Shemitah. Shimon can't enter the field, but Shimon can go ahead and derive benefits from notos. Construct 2. Reuven makes a neder. You cannot get any food benefit from me. If the neder was made before the Shemitah year, Shimon is allowed to enter the field, right? Allowed to enter the field, but cannot eat the produce. If the neder was made during the Shemitah year, Shimon could enter the field and eat the produce. Good. Says the Gemara. Let's analyze. Rabbi Shmuel, so Rabbi and Shmuel both said the following. Nechasim elu alecha. So we'll say this is interesting. Rabbi and Shmuel will say now are going to introduce a couple of new cases. And the Lashon, if you notice, by the way, is going to look a little bit different than the Lashon of our Mishnah. And that is by design. So listen to this. Rabbi Shmuel said as follows. Nechasim elu alecha. Reuven says to Shimon, this property is prohibited, right? It's prohibited upon you. So lifnei shvius, if Reuven made this neder before Shemitah, ein yor l'soch sadeu. So ultimately, again, then Shimon can't come into the field. Ve'eno ochel min hanotos, and he's also not allowed to eat from any of the produce that extends out of the field. Af al pi shig yeshiyas. Now we'll say this is true even when Shemitah comes. So we'll say, now listen to what Rabbi Shmuel is saying. Rabbi Shmuel is saying, if you make a neder, Reuven makes a neder, right? Nechasim elu alecha. This property is usher to you. So again, now Reuven's making that neder before Shemitah. So once he makes it, Shimon can't come into the field, right? And also can't eat notos. Not only that, even once Shemitah comes, he still can't enter the field, and he still can't eat notos. Okay. So the Gemara says, Ve'im b'shviyas nadar. However, if Reuven made this neder during Shemitah itself, then ein yor l'soch sadeu. Okay, so therefore I will say this neder still has the ability to preclude Shimon from entering into the field. Aval ochel min hanotos. But what does end up happening is Shimon is permitted to eat from the fruit that extends out of the field. Okay, because we'll say it's Shemitah. So Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish, will say that's Rav and Shmuel. Contrast that Rabbi Yochanan. For Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish say Demri Tarvayu Nechasi Alecha or Alayich. Right? If Reuven says to Shimon, my property is usher to you. Lifnei Shvius, if he makes his neder before Shvius, so what's the halacha? Ein yorid l'soch sadeu ve'ein ochal min hanotos. Ultimately, again, so far they agree. Right? Shimon can't enter the field and he can't eat notos. Higia Shvius, once Shemitah comes, Eino Yored L'Soch Sadeu, Shimon still can't enter the field. Wow. Aval Ochel Hu Es Hanotos. But he can eat the notos. So we'll say, here's the point of contention. Here it is, right? So remember again, what's happening over here is as follows. Reuven is making a neder. Shimon nechasi alayich, right? Nechasi alayich, my property is usher to you. He's making this neder before Shemitah. So everyone agrees. What can Shimon do before Shemitah? Can't go into the field. Can't eat the notos. What's the point of contention, Rabbi Sai? Now Shemitah comes. According to Rav and Shmuel, so Shimon still can't eat the notos. But according to Rav Yochanan Reish Lakish, when Shemitah comes, now he can eat the notos. So what's the macholkas? Watch this. It's incredible. So the Gemara says, Lema b'haKohen. What are they arguing about? The Rav Shmuel, sorry, this is so fascinating. Rav Shmuel must hold, Adam oser davar shibir shuso, afilu chishiyetze mer shuso. Let's say Rav Shmuel hold like this. A person has the ability to answer something when it's under his domain or in his ownership, and that level of prohibition extends even when? Once it leaves his ownership. Now watch this. Therefore, Rav Shmuel say like this. When Reuven says to Shimon, my property is usher to you, right? I hereby take an neder, you cannot benefit from my property. So before Shemitah, Shimon can't come into the field, Shimon can't have notos. Rav and Shmuel will say, even once Shemitah comes, Shimon still can't have the notos. But at Shemitah, everything is hefker. Rav and Shmuel hold that essentially, once you create an isser upon something that is under your ownership, even if it leaves your ownership, the prohibition still remains. So even though Shemitah now comes, the notos are still going to be usher to Shimon. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, on the other hand, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish hold, Ein Adam Osir Davar Shevishuso L'Chashiyetim Rishuso. On the other hand, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish say, no. That's not true. That's not true. In other words, halacha l'maisa, you could create isra upon something when Rabbi say when you own it, right? When it's under your domain, right? But once it leaves your domain, then what? We're done. In other words, you can no longer create a state of isser for something that you no longer own. Therefore, again, when Reuven made the neder devolves upon Shimon before Shemitah. Once Shemitah comes, all produce becomes hefker anyway. Therefore, Reuven has no ability to prohibit that produce to Shimon. So the Gemara says as follows: "This is bra. Mikal madar ein adam oser davar shevishuso zaysim mishuso." The Lord says, is that true? In other words, is there anyone who disputes the concept that once you prohibit something, it remains prohibited even once it leaves your ownership? Right? In other words, the Gemara is suggesting, doesn't everyone subscribe to that concept? After all, because if you don't, imkain niflagi b'nechasim elu v'choshekein b'nechasai. So you will say, if that's the case, if you notice, by the way, the way the Gemara over here frames the case is talking about nechasai, my property. And I will say, my property is even a bigger chiddush because what a person is saying is the prohibition upon these items the prohibition should only develop upon these items when they're mine. When they're mine. As opposed to a generic lashon of nechasim, which means that you are creating a state for the property, no matter if I own it or I don't own it. So if it's really true that the point of contention is whether or not the person could create an isser that extends even when he no longer owns it, don't phrase it as nechasai, as my property. Rather phrase it as nechasim, this property. That's a bigger chiddush. Kosh came b'nechasai. Visu. Furthermore, again, what about the following case? Hatnan, the adam oser davar shebeshuso l'chashiyetim mishuso. We'll say we have a case that explicitly says that a person has the ability to create a state of prohibition upon an item that he currently owns, and the state of prohibition continues even when he no longer owns it. Where do we see that case? Listen to this. This nan we learned. Homer libno, a person says to his son, Konam sha'ata ne'neli. Man says to his son, I make a neder that you, my son, cannot benefit from me. I will say, by the way, if you notice again, it's the opposite, right? The other day we had the case of a father says to his son, I take a neder that I will not benefit from you. Remember again, why does a father take such a neder from his son? In order to not be mavatal the son from Talmud Torah, right? I want my son to be a Talmud Chacham. I don't want him to be preoccupied with doing things for me. So I say to him, I take a neder not to get any benefit from you. Okay, this is the reverse case. Father says to his son, I hereby take a neder prohibiting you from getting any benefit from me. For whatever reason he makes that neder. So watch this. So the Gemara says, Meis, Yiroshenu. Ultimately, it will say, what happens? If the father dies, then what? The son has the ability to inherit him. Why does the son have the ability to inherit his father? Why? Because it will say, remember again, the father made the neder upon his property. Once the father is dead, therefore what? It's not his property anymore. If it's not his property anymore, then the son has the ability to inherit him. Conversely, I will say now, but I'll just point out, that goes Fitzionim. You see that bays and a half a bracket over there? So that points you to the right-hand side margin over there. Hagos Fitzionim changes the girsa. Bechayai ubemosi. Let's say the father says to his son, I hereby prohibit my property upon you. Right? Both during my lifetime and my death. Bechayav ubemoso. Bechayai ubemosi. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Amid beis. It means lo yirashenu. If the father dies, the son doesn't inherit him. So we'll say, what do you see from here? Now, the fact that the father has the ability to make this neder indicates to us what Rabbi say, that you could control the status of something even when it's no longer in your domain. Right? Because remember again, what's the father saying over here? The father saying to his son, both during my lifetime and during my death, you may not benefit from my property. Okay, so the father's alive. I understand why the neder is in effect, because the property is his. The chiddush over here is, even once the father dies, the son is not permitted to benefit from the property. But one second, the father's dead. The father's dead, he no longer owns it. Elamai, what do you see? That halacha lamaisa, you can legislate the status of something even once it's no longer in your domain. To which the Gemara says, no, this is not a raya. Why? Shiny hacha v'ka'amarle b'chayav u'b'moso. I will say, maybe it's different over here. Why? Because you're explicitly saying it. In other words, it could, if you look at Rashi, by the way, Rashi on the left-hand side, 3 lines in, Shiny hacha da'amar b'chayav u'b'moso, aval hecha da'amar b'stam, ema li'olam ein o adam osias. Well, this is actually very interesting. The Gemara is suggesting like this. Maybe, if you don't articulate anything, right, you don't explicitly say anything, your ability to legislate status only applies when the item is under your direct ownership, right? But once the item is no longer under your direct ownership, you cannot legislate its status, right? You cannot determine its status. However, if you explicitly say, I determine the status of this item both when I own it and even after I no longer own it, einachinami, that could work. So I'll say, so for example, if a father says to his son, I hereby take an neder that my property is usher to you, so I'll say, if he says that statement, then what? During the father's lifetime, the property is usher to the son. Once the father dies, the property is mutter. Why? Because once the father dies, it's no longer his property. However, if the father says to his son, my property is prohibited to you both during my lifetime and after my death, in that case, since he explicitly stated it, then einachinami, the property remains usher to the son even once the father dies. Ella, so the Gemara says, mikol makom kasha. So the Gemara says, still we're left with a problem. Ella, here we go. B'nechasim elu. So we'll say, listen to this. The Gemara is going to suggest now. The truth is, everything comes down to the wording that you use in the formulation of the neder. So we'll say, so remember again, just to take a step back, what we're hyper-focused on right now, we'll say, is the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel versus Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. And the machlokes seems to manifest itself, we'll say, in one specific case, which is, Reuven makes a neder that Shimon cannot get benefit from him. Okay, so now what's the halacha? So Shimon can't come into the field, Shimon can't come into Reuven, Shimon can't eat notos. What happens when Shemitah comes? Shabbos say, Rav and Shmuel said, produce is usher. Shimon still can't eat the produce. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish say, the produce becomes mutter during Shemitah. So we were suggesting that maybe their machlokes is about whether or not a person could usher something that they no longer own. During the Shemitah, right, Reuven no longer owns the produce. So therefore, again, based on that, Rav and Shmuel say that halacha l'maisa is still, you can determine the status of something even if you no longer own it. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish say no. The problem is with that is we've kind of just established that no, everyone agrees in principle that you can determine status of an item even if you no longer own it. As long as you once owned it, you can determine its status even after you no longer own it. So that can't be the point of contention. Ella, b'nechas, so rather the Gemara says you're right. Rather, the machlokes of Rabbi Osai is in the word choices. Here we go. Ella, b'nechasim elu, kuli amalo pligi. So Rabbi Osai, this is very interesting. So the Gemara says, if Reuven uses the lashon, he says, nechasim elu asurim lecha. Reuven says, this property will be asur to you. Everyone agrees that even if Reuven no longer owns the property, it'll still remain prohibited to Shimon. So for example, Shemitah comes, everyone will agree that Shimon still can't partake of that produce. So where's the machlokes? Ki pligi b'nechasai. Listen to this. So where's the machlokes? The machlokes is where Reuven says, my property, Shimon, will be asur to you. Rav Shmuel Savri, lo shanu nechasim elu, lo shanu nechasai, adam oser. So I'll say Rav and Shmuel hold, it doesn't make a difference whether you say nechasim elu or nechasai. Once Reuven creates a status of prohibition of this produce on Shimon, that status remains even if Reuven, quote unquote, no longer owns the property, like Shemitah comes. The prohibition will still remain. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish Tzvi, nechasim adam oser, nechasai ein adam oser. Fascinating. So also, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish say like this. You see, if you use lashon of nechasim elu, this property should be usher to you. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish will agree that even when Shemitah comes, the produce is going to remain usher to Shimon. Why? Because you made a more generic statement about the produce. However, if we still have nechasai, we both say nechasai means what? Nechasai means what? My property. What does my property mean? What does my property mean? As long as I explicitly own it. As long as I own it, it will be usher to you. The inference from that is, if I don't own it, for example, when? Shemitah. Like in halacha l'maisa, Shimon, it'll no longer be asid. So what's the Gemara suggesting that's the source of this machlokes. Two minutes in 1 second. Is there anyone who holds that we don't make a distinction between the lashon of nechasim versus nechasai? In Hatanan we learned, ha'omer the chaveiro, person says to his friend, Homer the chaveiro, konam l'sok beischa sha'ani nechnas. Sadcha sha'ani lokeach. Let's listen to this. Right? I say to Reuven, I'm switching on the names a little bit, right? Reuven, konam l'sok beischa. I take a neder that I will not walk into your house. Or I take a neder, I will not walk into your field. Or, sha'ani lokeach, I will not purchase this field. Well, your field, what's the halacha? Mace, if Reuven dies, or Reuven sells this field or this house to someone else, mutter. So I'm allowed to walk into the house, I'm allowed to walk into the field, I'm allowed to purchase it. Why? I will say, why? It's not Reuven's field anymore. Remember, I will say, in this lashon, this verbiage over here, I made this totally dependent on it being Reuven's house, Reuven's field. So therefore, again, if it's no longer Reuven's house, no longer Reuven's field, I have the ability to go ahead and enter in or purchase it. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Conversely, lebayis zeh shani nichnas, soda zu shani lokeh. But if I say Reuven, right, I take a neder that I am not entering into this house, I am not entering into this field, then what's the halacha? Even meis o shamachu la'acher, even if Reuven died or he sold it to someone else, aser, it still remains aser. So we'll say, what do you see from here? Everyone accepts the distinction between whether or not the prohibition is, we'll call it phrased in the generic or phrased in the possessive. It does make a difference. In other words, if the neder is phrased in the possessive, then once Reuven no longer owns the field, no longer owns the house, halacha l'maisa, I can go into it. I can purchase it. If it was phrased in a general sense, the house, the field, the issue is going to remain. Ella, here we go. Rather, Ella ki kam Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish benechasai, Rav Shmuel benechasim elu v'lo pligi. Beautiful. Rabbi say it's always so good to have a sugya that makes shalom. The Gemara says it's not machlokes. It's not a machlokes. We're talking about two different cases. See here, Rabbi say Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So also remember, let's take a step back. Reuven's making a neder. What's his neder? Shimon, you cannot get any benefit from me. So what's the halacha? So let's go through what's the halacha. Shimon can't enter into Reuven's field, nor could Shimon eat notos. He can't eat notos either, right? It's produce that extends out of the field. They will say, what happened? Shemitah comes. Now Rabbi says, here where things got tricky. Rav and Shmuel said, the prohibition upon the notos remains. Right, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish says no more prohibition on the notos. We thought it's a machlokes. But it's not a machlokes. The two different cases. In the case of Rav and Shmuel, where the prohibition remains on the notos, what lashon did Reuven use? Nechasim elu. This property, generic statement. The Bible says we established when you say nechasim elu, even if the property no longer belongs to Reuven, the prohibited state remains. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, who said that when Shemitah comes, the produce becomes permitted. What was the lashon of Reuven? Nechasai, my property. And when you say Nechasai, I will say, what happens when Shemitah comes? What happens when Shemitah comes? not your property anymore. If it's not your property, therefore halacha l'maisa, it's not a problem, and therefore Shimon could benefit. Therefore, it turns out that halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says that really Rav and Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are actually not arguing at all. And I just want to point out, this is actually how the Rambam paskins. Right? I will say that ultimately again, that halacha l'maisa, he accepts this distinction. That if Reuven said nechasim elu, even when Shemitah comes, the produce with the notos would still be prohibited to Shimon. But if he said nechasai, my property, then when Shemitah comes, Shimon would be permitted to go ahead and eat from the produce, because the produce no longer belongs to Reuven. Incredible. Well, so let's finish off the sugya. Says the Gemara, ubishvius en yor lesoch sadeu. Rabbi said, interestingly enough, that halacha l'maisa. So remember again, let's go back for just a second. So Rabbi say in the version of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So what's the halacha? Shemitah comes. Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish said that what? Shimon could eat of the notos, but he can't enter into the property. So the Gemara says, "Ubishvius in yor lesoch sadeu, ma'ishna the ochel min notos." Why is it that Shimon is allowed? So, according to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, who are now understanding this as a case of nechasai, right? My property. Shemitah comes, Shimon is permitted to go ahead and eat of the produce. So the Gemara says, why is it that Shimon is allowed to eat from the produce? The Gemara says, because the fruit is hefker. And therefore, again, it's no longer Ruvain's. Because it's no longer Ruvain's, therefore Shimon is permitted to enjoy it. Ara nami afkara. The land is also hefker. And therefore, if the land is hefker, then what Rabbi say? Then Shimon should be permitted to enter into the field as well. Amar ula ba'omdin ilanos al hagvulin. We're talking about a case where the fruit trees sit on the border of the field. And therefore, again, I will say, Shimon doesn't have to enter into the field to get the fruit. He could simply stand outside of the field to get the fruit. So I will say, what's the pshat? If you look at the Ran, 7 lines up from the bottom. Amar ula ba'omdin ilanos al hagvulin. Einach yemai the lilkot ilanos sheve emsa sada mutar leri lesocha. Aval lilkot ilanos she omdin al hagvulin lo derachmana lo afkara la'ara el lilkot peroseh. So I will say, this is incredible. So the Ran explains, when did the Torah make the land hefker during Shemitah? Only for the purpose of going out and harvesting fruit. But if you could harvest the fruit without utilizing the land, then the land is not hefker. In other words, I will say, it's actually fascinating. The land is not wholesale hefker. The land is hefker for utilitarian purposes. So if you need to traverse someone else's field in order to collect produce, the Torah says you're allowed to do that. But if you could collect the produce without traversing someone else's land, then the land is no longer hefker for you, which is fascinating. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, we're talking about a case where Shimon could collect the produce without traversing the field. If that's the case, the field is not hefker for Shimon purposes, and therefore, again, he would still be prohibited to traverse the field because of the neder. Such a fascinating idea, to which the Gemara says, Shimon al Yakim Omer. So we'll say, so again, what I just want to point out is, according to this approach, this is really an interesting new understanding in Shemitah. So it turns out that according to this approach, for Shemitah purposes, fruit will always be hefker. Land is only hefker in that it's needed to collect produce. But if the produce can be collected without traversing the land, then the land is not hefker. Therefore, in this case, where Shimon is enjoined by a neder, right? Shimon is prohibited by a neder, so Shimon is allowed to traverse Reuven's land in that he needs to traverse it to collect the produce. But the case in question is where the produce could just as easily be picked while Shimon is standing outside of the field. If that's the case, then he doesn't have the reshus to go out and traverse the field. Other possibility, the Gemara said, well, this will finish. Other possibility, the Gemara says, it was very interesting. The other concern, maybe you will say, while it's true that you're allowed to go ahead and, right, Shimon is allowed to go ahead and go onto Reuben's field to pick produce, that's dafka only to pick produce. What can't he do? He can't just simply spatzir in the field. Right? He can't go ahead and just tarry in the field. That would be a prohibition. That would be a violation of the neder. So the Gemara says, perhaps what we're concerned over here in this case is that Allah Chalamaisa, Shimon is going to go on the field to pick the fruit, which would be permitted. But then after picking the fruit, what is he going to do? He's going to remain there. And sitting there, being idle in the field, that's a violation of the neder. That's why halacha l'maisa, what we say, and also that's how the Rambam paskins as well. That's why we say that in this case, interestingly enough, when Shemitah comes, as much as Shimon is permitted to get the produce, he's not permitted to go on the field, out of concern that if we allow him to go on the field to pick the produce, which is technically mutter, he may carry longer than necessary to collect the fruit, and that will be a violation of the neder. We'll say, shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone. Sorry about the delayed start.